Hello, and welcome to Leadership in Challenging Times on the NorQuest College podcast. Hosted by Dr. Jody Abbott, President and CEO of NorQuest College, and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson, 3rd Canadian Division Headquarters with the Canadian Army, this podcast will discuss challenging and difficult topics affecting community, business, and soldiers alike. The presenters may at times express their personal opinion or take a contrary position to expand the conversation, ranging from leadership to sensitive subjects to current affairs. The podcast will tackle issues in an open manner with an eye on identifying and expanding ideas from all sides of the discussion. Jody and Jeff will now start the podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to podcast number 10. Today's podcast is a bit of a serious one. We're going to be talking about the armistice. 100 years ago this month, World War I ended. And we felt it was probably a good idea to talk about it because it's a pretty significant event in Canadian history, and a lot of people aren't aware of the details of it. So today we got a special guest, a good friend of mine, Major Jade Watson, Deputy Commanding Officer, 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Jade, thanks for coming out.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
So we're going to start off, I wanted to talk about the armistice and the significance of it and what it meant for Canada and that moment where the war ended. And so those listeners who aren't familiar, World War I, 1914 to 1918, the armistice was signed and went into effect at the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. So November 11th at 11 a.m., the armistice came into effect. And in essence, the war ended at that point. Unfortunately, the fighting went on right up to the end of it. There was a pursuit campaign that was taking place, and people, unfortunately, were dying right up to the very end. It was very sad from that. But when the war did end, there was a significant moment in Canada as the message you can imagine, with history. One of the things always is try to understand and immerse yourself in that time frame. Everybody was waiting for this moment. They knew the war was ending. It was coming close, but was waiting for that moment. And I just wanted to read a quote from It Can't Last Forever, the 19th Battalion in the Canadian Corps in the First World War by David Campbell. And it sort of brings together some really interesting comments. It says, across the Atlantic, crowds were no less joyous when the news of the armistice broke. It was 2:30 a.m. local time when the wire services first flashed the news to Toronto, touching off gigantic celebrations in the middle of the night. Church bells pealed, factory whistles wailed, and extras were printed. Fire trucks drove up and down the streets sounding their sirens. Awakened from sleep, tens of thousands of Torontonians headed downtown. Many traveled in night clothes and slippers. Propriety demanded only that a winter coat be thrown over top. Hanging off streetcars and piling onto running boards of automobiles, people flooded to the core. Yonge Street was packed with revelers. The crowds were so thick that dozens of people walked over roofs to get to the party. Coal scuttles, tin cans, and garbage lids were grabbed, anything to add to the din. Bonfires were set to ward off the pre-dawn chill. Cheering patriotic songs and swirling bagpipes filled the air. Fireworks lit up the sky. Conversations were impossible and unnecessary. A 24-hour victory party, 1,567 days in the making, had begun. So I thought that would be a great little quote to understand what the impact was in Canada at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting because, our country would have been part of the war in terms of what do we do to protect our country? How do we protect others? And the anticipation of the armistice, I just can't imagine. And even the fact that the news comes by wire. Think of how our world has changed. But it came at 2:00 in the morning, and the world became alive again. And Canada became alive again because I think people knew what that might mean. But I'm not sure actually as Canadians today, we actually do understand the impact of armistice. And so today I think is a very important conversation so that we can remind ourselves of why was this so important in our history as Canadians.
Well, one of the biggest things, it wasn't just the fact that the war ended. The combat ended in November 1918, but the far-reaching effects that it had on Canadian society and how it changed things, not just internally in Canada, but in the international order writ large, is actually one of the most fascinating things about it that I think has kind of gotten drowned out in history. Prior to World War I, and Pierre Burton writes a really good book, Marching as to War. It's kind of the history of Canada at war from the Boer War onwards. But we described Canadian society was still very much stratified. It was still quite a bit in the British mold. where you still had a class-based society where there was the wealthy and, if not the ennobled, then certainly the privileged in society. There wasn't much of a middle class. Then you had the working class. And especially in like smaller towns or in communities, the people who had wealth, who had the family name, still exercised a great amount of influence and power in a way that I think is hard for people to understand nowadays. And then when everyone went and fought in the trenches, so a lot of like the units that went over, like the guys who were the commissioned officers or went over initially as the leaders were usually guys who came from the leadership strata of society. But after like 2 or 3 years of combat in the trenches, I mean, not all these guys performed well. Some did, some didn't. Some guys who like were a mine worker ended up commanding battalions by the end of the war, because like, if anything, war leads very much to a meritocracy in how people get promoted. So by the end of the war, you've got all these returning veterans coming back who might be looking at the son of the local bigwig, and it's like he was an absolutely horrible officer and couldn't lead, and was actually a coward. Why should he maintain his social status back here in Canada? Whereas like, the local, like one of the local farmers are like a mine worker, factory worker, was one of the best combat leaders we had over there. That kind of brought home a different, it rewrote what legitimacy meant. And it wasn't just in terms of your combat performance. It became a much more idea of a meritocracy within society. So it erased a lot of those boundaries that were primarily based on class still in 1914. And while it wasn't a clean break in 1918, over the course of the next generation, it rewrote how Canadian society viewed itself and how like there was a pecking order in society. That's not to still say that old power structures don't still exist to this day, but it made it far, far more egalitarian.
It's interesting because what I'm hearing is that it created a new type of culture where equality was more evident. And that if you worked hard, you would be recognized for working hard, and that in your, I know nothing about war, so I'm going to be very honest about that, but I'm assuming in war, it doesn't matter where I came from, who I really am, but that we all have a job to do, and part of that job is protecting one another and the connections that you would make as soldiers in war. And what I'm hearing is that when everyone came back and when the war ended, there was more recognition in the broader society, not just in the military world in your world, but there was a really important spillover that happened in our society. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, one of the big things that most people miss, because of the wars we've had in the last little while, only a very small portion of Canadians have been impacted by it. World War I, there was very few people who could honestly say they weren't directly or indirectly impacted. Someone they knew, somehow they were influenced, their lives were changed. We had conscription, we had all these other issues that fundamentally changed our country in 1917, created huge political tensions in our country. No one was immune to it. There's no one who could just idly say, I'm on Twitter today and I'm oblivious to the world around me. You couldn't be. You were directly impacted. Everyone was directly impacted, the entire country. And we haven't had an event, since World War II, really, where you could say that every single person in the country was directly affected by that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a good vignette of within the war of how decision-making changed. So Sir Sam Hughes was our Minister of Militia at the time, the equivalent of Minister of National Defense in the modern day. He was immensely powerful. He was erratic and almost borderline crazy in some ways by the end of his life. But he was a very, very powerful personality. He actually dominated government once the war started. His son Garnet Hughes ended up being given command of the 5th Canadian Division. So fighting in France, there was 4 Canadian divisions that comprised the Canadian Corps. The 5th Division was being stood up and it was being trained in England. It was given to Garnet Hughes, primarily because he was Sir Sam Hughes' son, not that he was a particularly good soldier. General Arthur Currie, who was actually commander of the Canadian Corps, as we were going into the final campaign, the 100 Days campaign in the end of the war, there was a push to bring the 5th Canadian Division over into France, form 1st Canadian Army, and General Currie would become he would be elevated. He would be on par with all of his British Army commander counterparts. And it was seen as a big political coup for Canada. And Garnet Hughes would come over and command his division in France, which was what his father wanted. Arthur Currie said that's actually not the best thing for the Canadian Corps because it would dilute us too much. He disbanded the 5th Canadian Division in in England, brought it all over and beefed up all the Canadian divisions that were fighting so they could sustain more combat losses or actually inflict more on the Germans. And it was like, sorry, Garnet Hughes, you're not commanding a division. Sam Hughes lost his marbles about it, but Currie held firm. He said, because this is what is best for us. I don't care what's best for your son. So at a kind of a higher political level that was starting to infringe on the operational level in combat. Arthur Currie held his ground. He said, this is what's best for us as an army. That kind of conceptually about how you see decisions being made in society was something that came back from the war. A stronger sense of pragmatism, and not this is what the elite wants. It's what is best for us as an army, and now kind of coming back. This is what's best for us as a society. So I've always found that interplay, because it almost cost General Currie his job. But he basically put his foot down and said, "Do you really want to lose me?" Because he's the finest combat commander that Canada's ever produced. He was a reservist from British Columbia who was actually, I think he was a real estate. He worked in real estate. Hadn't done very well prior to the end of the war, but he came back and ended up being president of McGill.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
And-
but it was that kind of a new look about how decisions get made in society that a lot of these combat veterans brought back. That I said, it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of the next generation, it fundamentally altered how people saw things. And all these returning veterans said, I have a say in how my society runs. It's not just elites are going to tell us how things are going to work in Canada, and I'm here to work and make it all happen. All these guys who had served their country overseas came back and said, I actually have a stake in society because you sent me to fight. I defended all these things that you said you held dear. I'm not coming back, I wasn't cannon fodder in the trench. I'm not coming back to be cannon fodder here in society again. And like I said, it fundamentally altered the way that society was structured over the next generation.
So it's interesting because I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing how it changed things in people's position in society in Canada, how decisions are made. But I also think there's a leadership piece there that's really interesting in that to me, the way you've described it is there was a crisis leadership opportunity. And the individual had to make a very, very tough decision. And the decision was based on the facts of what were happening at the time and trying to get the right outcome for more people. And really the right outcome for a country, not just more people, really for a country. And that took tremendous courage to stand up to someone who had incredible power in the country because he was essentially the minister, and making that kind of decision. So it's also interesting from a perspective of it set a new potential culture change in our country, but I also think it may have also been a great illustration of how leadership can impact that culture. And for some, that to me is a massive decision, a really big decision. And it's also putting the values of your country ahead of your own values, because he could have been walked out the door or walked off the field.
Oh, absolutely. And Jay just touched on the top part of it. I mean, if you're follow history, the story of the Ross rifle. I mean, Canada was equipped with a defective rifle because some people's wives, we won't go because it's a big long story, thought it was a really good rifle, and Canada was then left to deploy to the trenches with a rifle that was garbage, and we quickly got rid of it. And so the influence and power Jade speaks to was almost complete. And what you're seeing as these veterans come back in the 1920s, you see the formation of the Canadian Legion so that they can lobby on behalf of veterans. You're seeing a greater requirement that our country had before for, I don't like to use socialized medicine, but everybody needed to have access to medical support because everybody that was coming back had some degree of something. If it wasn't disease or a physical injury or mental injury, there was a requirement. So our requirements for bigger government organization in terms of supporting individuals also grew at the same time, which is very, very fascinating. And if you look at the prairies, we have political parties that start forming in the prairies in the 20s and 30s that lead to instrumental change of basically the foundations of what our three-party system is now. Well, that's not fair to call it three-party system, but you know what I'm saying. But those roots were all planted, were all seeded by the end of the war and those veterans coming back. And we should note, too, there's sort of two things to explain things. One is that the Canadian Corps, this was a big deal for us as a colony, for us to have Canadian officers commanding Canadian soldiers. And the amazing thing was, under the brilliant leadership that we had at the time, we had senior leaders doing something that had never been done before, and that was rehearsing attacks, doing everybody practicing what they were going to do, rather than more of a cannon fodder. Generally, tell a soldier, just go over that way and shoot at things. We rehearsed maneuver, we rehearsed things. So the soldiers were also being taught was, I'm not going to just throw your life away. I'm going to give you the best opportunity to succeed. And that was one of the big takeaways that we talk about Vimy and those battles that happened at that point. Canada just didn't charge off and attack an enemy and take great casualties as was happening in the Somme and with other countries. Our leadership expressed all the way down, no, you matter, and we're going to be as successful as we possibly can. So it was a real game changer, rehearsals, and I know Jade loves this stuff. That rehearsal component of it, new, innovative, revolutionary in some ways about how you lead soldiers.
No, I think the word that really comes out of this is empowerment. General Currie recognized that in the First World War, like one of the headaches that they had was that no one could talk to each other. Like radios didn't exist, and there were these big, chunky, huge apparatus or apparati that you couldn't just carry around as a man-pack radio like we do now. Like now, I have a small radio that's about the size of a Tim Hortons coffee cup that I can talk to someone 10 kilometers away on. Right back then, you couldn't do that. It was all telegraph or carrier pigeons or runners. So one of the things General Currie realized that, and the way that they took casualties, like sergeants, lieutenants, all these guys were leading from the front. That's part of the Western culture of fighting. They're also usually the first guys who get killed. So your courage gets paid in full in that sense. But they realized that there was corporals and sergeants that were taking over higher and higher levels of command due to the fact that their initial leaders were getting killed. So General Currie was every guy in the Corps needs to understand the plan 2 levels up. They need to be empowered for it. So if at the end of the day, if there's only a private and a corporal left on the position commanding 35 guys, they all have a map, they all have a compass, and they all knew what was going on. And that kind of empowerment of what hitherto had been treated as, you're the guy who works in the factory floor and you're going to do what we tell you because we think you're uneducated, you're illiterate, and that's all you're good for. Every man in the Canadian Corps was treated like a leader. And I think that sense of empowerment, not only organizationally from Currie's point of view of the exponential growth in combat power, or what would probably in its civilian equivalent of efficiency and productivity in the workplace. What he got out of that organizationally from the top down, from the bottom up, you're looking at a 19-year-old kid who thought he was going to spend the rest of his life just working on the same farm or in the same factory his dad did, being told that he mattered and he was important and he was a key cog in this and he had potential. And it's once you take that lid of potential off and you have that kind of opportunity offered, it's hard for guys to come back to a society and go back to just being a worker bee when he's hey man, I commanded a platoon overseas. I was at Vimy Ridge, right? And General Currie believed in me. My leaders believed in me. And now society, I have a lot I can offer society. Society needs to believe in me too. So it wasn't just the mechanistic part of the training, which, believe it or not, it's 100 years later, and the way that soldiers train that Currie came up with is the same way we train guys now, because over a century, no one's come up with a better way of doing it. I've worked with a lot of our NATO allies, and I've worked with a lot of countries that used to belong to the Warsaw Pact, and Canada does not give up anything to any of them in terms of how well trained our soldiers are, and that started 100 years ago. But it comes back to what it did to society, that, you teach a 19-year-old kid that he has got potential and that he matters, that alters the fabric of the society that he comes back to.
But also we should also mention, to understand the core, we have to understand the recognition our country was given to form the core in the first place.
Yeah. So when Sam Hughes decided we're going to form the Canadian Army and send it overseas, Canada didn't really have much of an army. It had a couple regular force units, but their primary job was to train our militia. And our militia was not what it is today. Like our militia is quite well trained. It's got a very good support system. But back then it was basically a bunch of local guys would bring their hunting rifles together and they'd do some drill practice. And one of the local bigwigs would fund them. And he was made their colonel because he was the rich dude in town. And it was more of a social club as opposed to an actual fighting unit. Sam Hughes, basically all the militia units got mobilized. The call went out, and they brought everyone to Valcartier in Quebec, and that's where this huge training camp was set up. It was set up within months. It was actually an amazing feat of organization. But the army that Canada sent overseas, it didn't have a lot of traditions. It didn't have a sense of being an army. So it was parceled out initially amongst British units. So my regiment, the Patricias, we were actually formed in 1914 specifically to fight, and we were the guy who founded Hamilton Gault would only take veterans of the Boer War or any other war that Britain had fought. So it was a core of veterans that got sent over, and we actually went to fight first. But everyone else that came, they gained experience with the Brits, but over time, they started migrating all the Canadian divisions together because the Canadian commanders were more and more saying that we don't want to be parceled out. We're not just an adjunct to the British Empire anymore. We're a country, and we want Canadian people to command Canadian soldiers. So at Vimy Ridge, for the first time, all 4 divisions fought together. And we took Vimy Ridge. General Currie was commanding the 1st Canadian Division at the time, but he came up with a plan. The man who commanded the Canadian Corps was Sir Julian Byng. He was a British general, and he was loved by the Canadian Corps. They referred to themselves as Byng's boys, actually, because he didn't treat them like colonial cannon fodder. He actually really loved and cared for them. Which, again, when you're coming from a stratified society, it's one thing within Canada. It's another thing that the British mothership back home actually having one of its officers who was he's knighted, he's got Cern from his name, actually caring about them actually meant a lot to them. And then after Vimy Ridge, Byng went off to become an army commander, and Currie was elevated to command the Canadian Corps. So having a Canadian lieutenant general command the Canadian Corps of 100,000 soldiers was, for Canada, politically and socially a huge thing. And the fact that as the war went on, he became recognized as probably the finest commander of all in the British Empire. So by 1918, the Canadians and the Australians were actually the shock armies of the British Empire. So in the final 100 days campaign that broke Germany, so it started on it was funny that we always say the 11th of the 11th was the end of the war. The 8th of the 8th was what started it. So the 8th of August 1918, the Canadian Corps broke the Hindenburg Line, and along with the Australians. After that, the Australians couldn't sustain any more casualties, and they became their role got more limited, not because of the quality of what they had, but by the numbers. Whereas because Currie had made the Canadian Corps so much stronger by disbanding that 5th Canadian Division, we could sustain ourselves over a longer period of time. So for that final 100 days, we went from the area around Amiens and Arras all the way back to Mons, where the war started for the British Empire, and we were the spearhead of it. So when it came to the Versailles Treaty, and everyone's sitting around the table, so you've got all the old powers of Europe and America at the table. Canada had its own seat at the table, and we'd earned that political recognition because of what the Canadian Corps had done and the commitment that we'd made to it and how well it had performed. So that, and for us, for Australia, these were seminal moments in our history, not strictly in terms of military history, but in the development of our states as maturing countries. And it was one of the first, we stopped being just the little dominion that could, and we're actually treated like, a country in our own right that was earned, fighting in France and Flanders.
So it's interesting as you're talking. I've pulled out 4 things that I think are germane to what I'm hearing around the evolution of Canada really in the global society from a perspective, our role in war and our role in peacekeeping, and I'd like to talk a bit more about that and how that has evolved. But I've pulled out things that, I'm at NorQuest. I spend all of my time in NorQuest, so I'm trying to draw some lines on how does this tie to our organization, and some things that I'm hearing that really were important to our country, and I think also important to who we are today in Alberta at NorQuest with our students is one, how the events of 1918 impacted Canadian culture. So I heard that people came back. There was a more egalitarian type of environment that was creating. I've heard that it impacted where we went with our medical system in terms of how do we create health opportunities for all so that people can be cared for. I also heard about planful leadership, that it wasn't just that we're just going and there's chaos. It was, no, we actually led in terms of making sure that we had a plan to achieve the outcome that we needed to achieve. But because of that, there were a couple things that happened. I think I heard about empowerment, that it was about empowering every person that was part of a battalion. I probably got the words wrong, but the group who are going to defend our country and make things right, that everyone was empowered to do their job, which then led even more to this egalitarianism, particularly when people came back. And that in that, I heard you say really clearly, which I love this, is everyone was seen as a leader. And I think when everyone's seen as a leader, you're also giving confidence to people. People have hard jobs to do in war, in teaching, in whatever your profession is. You have hard work to do. So, but in that, by saying you're a leader, you're also building confidence in people. And imagine what happens when you build confidence. Everybody comes up a level, and that all got brought back to our country.
Absolutely.
And the last thing I heard was around camaraderie, that each individual was valued for what they brought to the game, and to all the activities that had to happen. But there was a camaraderie that came to a point of, I actually care about you. And so those principles, and some might say, boy, that's a really long string to connect NorQuest to those things. But I think that if you think of history and how it impacted our country, how that then impacted the post-secondary education system, how it impacted how Canada is so open, as is NorQuest, to people from all over the world, and being inclusive and saying everyone brings value to our society. I think there is a string that can be connected.
You're seeing the start of what Canada became. Like when and Jade, said it very, very well. In the past, we were just like everyone else. We were a colony. We were viewed, in some cases, backward. There was a very strong stratification. You can read lots of books about it. We were automatically at war when the UK was at, when the Empire was at war. That all changed, and it leads into World War II when you start seeing these changes. But those significant changes are the shaping of our country it is today. Our value system, our priorities, what we do. And many of those institutions, they may have gone different names, but a lot of those institutions still exist today. And I think it's really important for anyone listening to this to understand that everything starts us off. We're a young country. I always enjoy when you go to the UK and you talk to somebody and they say, hey, we're going to go to this restaurant, and then the restaurant's 600 years old, and you go, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, there's nothing in Canada that's 600 years old. And, when we say we're celebrating our 100th anniversary or something, that's like to them. But for us, that's a big deal. And understanding that our country really only got shaped to what it is today. It started 100 years ago. That's not that long ago for a country. Americans will talk about 1776 as the foundation of which their society was developed. Ours was, in basically November 1918, we stepped back. And we should also say, too, that a lot of times when you do the reading, we didn't all just come back the next day, got on flights, everybody came home. it took like a year to get everybody that was overseas. And we had occupation duties over there. We had, like, it didn't end. We didn't get troops back here really into the early 20s when we sort of said, hey, we're all back. We're kind of back to the steady state would be. So it was a long process. So those people greeting trains, it didn't just happen once, hey, we had a parade, it's over. This went on all the time. This was a very continuous. And the main junction that they were getting people from, they would land, they go up to St. Lawrence, they would land at various places, get on trains, and they would travel all the way across the country. Every day there was a troop train bringing troops all the way through until they basically showed up in wherever they were, and then they were dispersed at that location. And a lot of the soldiers were from communities. So if you're the 19th Battalion was from Toronto, 48th was from Edmonton, and all these different units, when they got there, they were basically, right, we're stood down. That's it. And the next day, the unit didn't exist anymore. They all went their own ways.
And that period of time that actually you guys spent in England, like in kind of the 1919 or 1920, you got guys who'd now been away from home, right, provided they'd survived that long. They'd been away from home for like 4, 5, 6 years. And, the 2 or 3 years that they might have spent sitting in the trenches was probably 5 lifetimes for most people. So they wanted to get home, but it wasn't just like the medical part that Jeff had initially touched on. The whole idea of the social contract got reworked. So the development of especially in Western societies of the idea that the government owes you something and then you owe something back to the government started like. The prince or the king provided you security so you didn't get robbed by bandits on the road, and then you paid him taxes. And you owed him militia service whenever he called you up. As that's evolved over time, like you come down to 1918, 1919, you've got these soldiers who are facing demobilization who have been away from their jobs now for like 5, 6, 7 years. Like they don't have a life to go back to, or they don't know what kind of life they're going to go back to because, a lot of these were very young men who their formative years are now where they would have like maybe gone to a tech school or they'd learned their trade from their father or whatever. They spent it like learning the trade of warcraft, which aside from like some of the leadership and managerial things that you can take back, there's not a lot of work for guys who can drop a mortar bomb, in the city of Edmonton.
Right.
So one of the things that they were like, what are you going to do for me to reintegrate me back into my life? So the idea of like the government, like this whole like social contract of, I have served the state. Now the state owes to take care of me. So welfare programs for guys who were disabled, who came back with like no legs or were like shattered physically and emotionally, because like PTSD isn't a new thing. It just used to be called shell shock.
Right.
And there was an incredibly sophisticated system to take care of it in 1918. And we rebuilt it again in the Second World War, and we've had to rebuild it again because of Afghanistan. But soldiers were actually very well taken care of. But getting guys back into jobs, which meant like there had to be public works programs. So after the First World War and the Second World War, you see huge spikes in these public works programs of like highways being built and everything else because soldiers had to be put back to work, and the state was like held responsible for doing so. And then education, guys were coming back. They're like, well, I left when I was 17 years old. I'm now 22 years old, and I have no skills, but I'm a really good machine gunner. The idea of like bursaries to send guys back for post-secondary education for trades training, that has carried on now through various different types of programs that aren't just military specific. But the idea now of like you mentioned post-secondary education, of educating a society, kind of a lot of the nucleus of that started in 1918, 1919, 1920, of having to educate all these soldiers so they could become productive members of society.
And that's a great point, because we were just talking about, Jody and I were talking about the new education benefits from Veteran Affairs, $40,000 to $80,000 available for veterans to go to school. And the nucleus, the genesis from this is World War I.
But
yeah, so the long-standing impact that it's had across Canada again. Yeah,
because that was part of, hey, we have a responsibility, post-soldier, serving the country, that there be an opportunity to improve your education.
Right.
Yeah, right. Which is, and that's kind of now spread to like government grants for like student loans, like all those, that type of idea of it came from, they realized now you've shown a bunch of people that they have potential. You've got a society that believes that they can have potential. Now you've enabled them, like, the power of education suddenly became fully realized. And I think there is a reason you see this exponential growth in science and technology, industrialization moving now into the information age. Kind of that period of, I kind of look at World War I and World War II from a historian point of view of it was one long European civil war, not two separate conflicts. Because the end of how the First World War ended in the terms that were forced upon Germany led directly to the Nazi Party in the Second World War. So really, issues that had bubbled through the late 1900s weren't resolved until 1945, and really not until 1989 when the wall came down in Germany, you ended up reunifying. We have a very, very narrow view of history sometimes. We forget these political questions of what political systems are going to dominate at any given time are usually solved over a century and take a couple wars to solve. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to call it a solution. But the idea of coming out of the war is the idea of everyone deserves an education or everyone should get an education, which, I mean, before that, you're lucky, not everyone could read. My grandpa left school in grade 7 to work on the farm. I mean, he could read, he could write, and he was a self-educated man because he loved to read, and he imparted his love of history to me. But he left the farm, he left school when he was in grade 7, and that was
normal too.
Which was normal.
Yeah, it happened a lot.
I mean, that stopped being normal 20 years later.
Yeah.
And I think and then you see through the 1930s, 40s, you go from mechanization, moving to the information age, that exponential growth is directly related to the fact that public education and post-secondary education became the norm as opposed to something only, again, for an elite that could afford it out of their own pocket. And the fact that the government realized that there was, it was actually good for the state to have people that educated, and people in the state feeling that they had, not necessarily a right to it, but what they could give back to this. If the state invested in them, they can reinvest it back into the state. That quid pro quo of a social contract between education, Medicare, social welfare, all these things, they find their genesis at the end of the war of, a couple 100,000 soldiers sitting around going, so what am I doing when I get home?
Yeah.
And contrasted to what was happening in Germany, those 100,000 soldiers that were in Germany were not having this happen. And they were facing hardships, lack of food, lack of education. So the structures that we had were not being celebrated over there. And as Jay aptly puts, created the genesis for what happened into the 30s, simply because what we took for granted at that point was not happening. Families were starving. There was not food. There was hyperinflation. All these things were happening, whereas we were educating our forces and organizing ourselves. So it's a very interesting sort of segue to how that history. We were talking about up on the wall here. I printed out the Edmonton Journal from the 11th of November, 1918, and we'll put a link in our description for where to find that. And it's absolutely fascinating because throughout it talks about making Germany pay reparations. We're going to seize their ships. We're going to do all this stuff. So you knew that right away. We were viewing this as getting our pound of flesh. And it segues into what you were saying. Yeah.
So basically, you came to an end of war, but you started to lay the groundwork for the next war.
On the conflicts,
yeah.
Yeah.
During the Age of Empires, there through the post-Napoleonic era, and we talk about Napoleon like it's ancient history, but it's 200 years ago, which actually isn't that long. Mm-hmm. But in 1914, that was less than 100 years ago since Napoleon had fallen. So anyway, I kind of digress.
That's it. It's all good. It's all good. It's all good.
To get back on track. Anyway, what had been called the German question after the unification of Germany in 1871 under Bismarck, you had this incredibly powerful industrial state that had used war to expand its borders to something that it thought it could control. And the rise of militarism in Germany actually, the Nazis were a bit of an aberration that came in at the end, but the expansionism and the whole the old joke that Germany and Prussia before it was an army that had a state was actually because the fact that Germans were very, very insecure about their place in Europe, because on one side you've got Russia, who was immensely powerful because of its manpower. You had France, who had for centuries had one of the best land armies in Europe, and you had a Germany with no defensible borders. Aside from the Rhine and the Elbe on the other side, there's no mountains, there's no massive forests, there's nothing that protects Germany. England was secure as an island. France had certain natural boundaries, especially on the side with Switzerland and the Alps. Belgium was never really a threat to them. So there was only that narrow part where Germany was. And France and Germany were paranoid about each other because of that open frontier, but Germany also had to worry about Russia. So they, much like the Spartan, Sparta had no walls, but it was defended by the finest army in Greece. The Germany built the same thing. So that whole question of like balancing out Germany that became a big problem during the Age of Empires in the late 19th century, like carried over into the 20th century, and it wasn't really solved until like World War II ended. The Cold War ended, and Germany got reintegrated into Europe and so on and so forth, or into like Western Europe. But at the end of the World War I, the French were like, this is never happening to us again. And they insisted on, like Jeff said, a pound of flesh. Like the Versailles Treaty was so harsh at French insistence because they wanted Germany crippled so they could never fight again. Britain kind of was on the fence, and they're like, actually, we're actually kind of cool with reintegrating Germany and making them our friend, because England was also always worried about France and the balance of power. And another thing that people forget, all those royal families were related.
Yeah,
so like
related.
the Tsar, the Kaiser, and the Queen were all related. And actually, Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, was Queen Victoria's grandson. And the family referred to him as Crazy Willie because he was somewhat erratic and had a chip on his shoulder and everything else. So England actually had to make a decision in the early 20th century whether they would ally with France or whether they would ally with Germany. And the biggest reason they didn't ally with Germany was because of Crazy Willie. They didn't trust him in his foreign policy of not dragging England down paths they didn't want to go. So they allied themselves with France.
And this is going to make a good segue to talk about the League of Nations, because that leads to some of the stuff I know Jody wanted to talk about. So, the League of Nations was the desire internationally, politically, although short-sighted and may not have the right views, to somehow not allow the conditions to exist where blind treaties would force countries into conflict that had unintended consequences. And the League of Nations was formed at that point to try to say, hey, let's talk this through.
And what President Wilson brought was a measure of humanitarianism to it. Because there had been the Congress of Vienna, the Congress of Europe. There had been other attempts within Europe to have a mechanism of negotiation and everything else, but it was always based on a balance of power. President Wilson wanted to bring was the fact that nations working together to better each other. So international politics weren't a zero-sum game of who gets a leg up over the other. It was a matter of what can we achieve if we work together. A mechanism for peaceful resolution of problems, and a mechanism that if everyone works together, we have exponential benefits as opposed to incremental give and takes. Like I said, it failed partially because the U.S. Congress wouldn't ratify it because they had a very strong isolationist bent. Germany bailed on it as soon as Hitler could get out of it. And France and England never really fully bought in to it. But that idea that we could make a better world by working together was something like that was a new paradigm that came out of it. But people were at least starting to be willing to listen, because World War I was so destructive. Like it destroyed a huge swath of northern France and southern Germany. Well, not really, more Belgium. We never really breached the German frontier in the First World War. I think the United Nations got a lot more traction after the First World War, because now you had a different polarity between superpowers in the United States and the USSR, but also because it was more countries had been affected by it. The First World War, they've been fighting in the Middle East, they've been fighting in the Mediterranean, they've been fighting in Africa, but not on the same scope and scale you see in the Second World War. So I think people kind of saw the light in 1918, 1919, but they kind of had the spotlight shone in their eyes in 1945 when it wasn't just now a swath of Europe that had been destroyed. Everything from kind of the central southern France, all the way to Moscow had been pulverized. I think and then you'd seen similar destruction in North Africa, similar destruction in the Pacific theater. People had an impetus to get together, but the idea of it came from Wilson and the end of the First World War, that we can be better than this. In some ways, it was somewhat politically naive. I'm a bit of a political realist myself, but the idea that we can be better and we should work together to be better was a new paradigm in international politics, especially amongst
and the
European
fact that we would even consider it at the time. If you jump back 20 years earlier, you wouldn't just get a bunch of politicians to get together to discuss it. It would have been kings and queens and other senior monarchy that would have got to make decisions for whole territories. This was a thought process that we could get together. And I find that's what's really fascinating for me, was that our geopolitical construct at that point said we can all get together and talk about an issue, which really had never occurred before at a global scale. This
So
was really the first time.
created a different type of communication that was more collaborative.
Just the willingness to do it. Just the willingness
willing
do
to
it.
come to the table and then try to figure out how to collaborate to get something done. The humanitarian approach, how has that really impacted what you do day to day? So if you are sent to another country to assist in a war effort, humanitarianism is a big piece of that.
Absolutely.
And I ask this question because many of our students at NorQuest College come from war-torn countries. And I know, Jeff, when you visit the college, you always come in uniform. And you do that on purpose, actually, so that you can have the opportunity to interact with students and talk about our approach as a Canadian military and it's really maybe not totally unlike our police services. So we have students often who will be afraid of our Edmonton City Police or the RCMP, where I see the police as helpful. I see them as approachable. They're someone that's going to help me. They're not going to harm me. And so part of Jeff visiting the college and our partnership with the Canadian military is that we are able to build understanding, build bridges, and I think it ties back to that humanitarian piece.
Absolutely. So a couple of things that when we talk about peacekeeping, and that was if you will, a foreign policy more than it was a military strategy. So we train as soldiers first, and when we're fully confident that we can do our fighting job, I mean, that's really simplifying it down, then we practice to go into an environment where we're going to do a task that's not fighting, but we practice our fighting stuff first. With the exception of one organization we call DART, the Disaster
Assistance
Response Team. And right now, they left last week, and they're in Indonesia, I believe. And what it is a whole bunch of people from all kinds of different jobs that get together, and their sole purpose is to do humanitarian relief. So they're then they're medical personnel, they're transport personnel, they're all that kind of stuff to go into disaster zones. We're also modifying some of what the roles that reserves take on. So reserves are citizen soldiers, live in the communities. I live here in Edmonton. I used to be full-time, now a part-time soldier. We're training units to be light urban search and rescue as well. So if there's a disaster inside our own country, we're preparing our troops for it. And I just finished as a commanding officer being basically the emergency response battalion commander for the province of Alberta. So, as an armed forces, we have that capability, we have that practice, but the peacekeeping component tends to be policy. So we have troops in Mali right now who are providing medical support as well as aviation lift like helicopters. And so our government comes into those things on the humanitarian side. But our military has always taken that on, is that we always look at, we're either going to be in a coalition, we're going to work with other countries. So we always have a very friendly approach to how we deal with other nations all the time at the international level. And we also recognize we're going to be employed to do humanitarian stuff. And so we've got contingencies and equipment. And a lot of times when we buy some of the stuff that we buy as equipment, there's always that, can we use it for domestic or emergency missions? So we have that humanitarian piece. But I really want to talk about, for the listeners that are here that may not be familiar with the Canadian military, that this is one of the reasons why I'm here. I love the college. I've been really enjoyed the last 4 years working with the college and working with Jody, is that some people get concerned about, hey, the Canadian military, they're just like something else. And I know that when you sit down with a Canadian soldier and you talk to them about their experiences and what they are, you suddenly realize this isn't an authoritative, grumpy people. That's not what it is. It's a really innovative, super people. The best experiences of my life have been with soldiers, and the experiences and learning to realize that these are some of the finest Canadians that we have. And that's why I've always been here, because I'm really hoping a lot of these new Canadians, as soon as they get their citizenship, come and join the reserves so they can give back to their community and realize that they'll become part of a team or a family that traces its traditions and its histories all the way back to those defining moments that created our country, as we came out of 1918. So it really is a thing. So a person listening who has some concerns about the military or whatever, your politics, it doesn't matter. the Canadian soldier is here for you. The Canadian soldier has always been a member of our community. They're not segregated or isolated. Some would argue the base might be a bit isolated, but if you work up there. But you know what? We're in the streets, and that's one of the reasons. I'm really glad you brought that up. I brought Jade here a half an hour early so we could sit downstairs and talk to people, and we did. 4 or 5 people came and talked to us, and that's really important that people understand that we're part of our Canadian fabric.
And I think at NorQuest, we're bridge builders. We believe in inclusion. We believe it's important for everyone in our society to have a place, to have an opportunity to grow, to learn. One of the, you talked about our immigrant population, student population. We also have a lot of Indigenous students. And when we look back in history, and I think sometimes this is forgotten and not celebrated enough, that both in World War I and World War II and the Korean War, the stats we have is that about 7,000 First Nations served for Canada. And we take great pride in celebrating the achievements of our Indigenous community. And, you know, I would just like to say to all of the families of those who served, our First Nations families, thank you for serving Canada. Sometimes you're forgotten, and we don't want that. And I think as we come up to Remembrance Day on November 11th, this really is about thanking and celebrating people who have made our country what it is today. We've heard today, you know, certainly I've learned a lot. Jade, your history is unbelievable.
He was the right
the
guy.
ability
I told you he was
to
the right guy.
totally
Yeah.
to be able to talk. I mean, you're mesmerizing. I got lost a couple times, but that's okay.
This guy, so did I. So
But I think what's important is what I heard today is just how important our history is to building our country, to who we are as a country. And I want to do a bit of a bridge to what is Armistice Day? What is Remembrance Day? And then we'll close off with a very important message.
Sure. I did a little bit of research because I found this quite fascinating that the world was a different place when the war ended. And so they knew right away, hey, we want to recognize the day the armistice was signed. That's a somber moment where we'll remember the end of the war. And so basically when the war ended, the king proclaimed, yes, we will celebrate Armistice Day. And that carried on until basically in 1921. A member of Parliament in Toronto said that wouldn't it be a great idea if we link Thanksgiving and Remembrance Day together, because we can remember the bountiful harvests and how great it is and how great our lives are, and sort of link that to change sort of Armistice Day into more of a celebratory place. So the Monday before the 11th November would be Thanksgiving, and then we would have this ceremony. And then on the 11th of November would be very, very basic, very somber, dignified remembrance ceremony. And so that went on for a little bit until a little bit later in 1931, people started saying, you know, we got to split the two things. It started breaking apart in 1925 when the Legion was formed, and they wanted to have a separate celebration and separate the two because they felt it was not the right ceremony. And so later in 1931, a member of Parliament for Comox, Alberni, put forward a motion to say Armistice Day, 11th November, no other day. It was actually included. It said, and on no other date. And so essentially it became a standalone date. And in Canadian traditions, Remembrance Day on the 11th of November at 11 o'clock, we have a rigid ceremony that we've been doing since 1931. And I know in my regiment, the Royal Regiment of Canadian Artillery, it says very specifically in our regimental orders that we only conduct remembrance ceremonies on Remembrance Day. We don't have separate remembrance ceremonies for certain other events. The only remembrance ceremony is the 11th of November. And so that became, as we know today, where we have the ceremony that you see on TV cenotaphs. Now, cenotaphs were being built from the 20s onwards. A lot of communities built their own cenotaphs. A lot of people don't realize that was community. Part of it was jobs for veterans. So these were local communities and churches that raised money to build these. So they employed veterans. Most of it was veteran labor. The one that was built here in Edmonton was entirely designed and constructed by veterans. And it became our first one in 1920, the first memorial here in Edmonton. And so you're seeing this sort of development of Remembrance Day into what it is today. So.
One of the things that you mentioned about the moment of silence, like in Canada, we've begun the tradition of or carry on the tradition of doing 2 minutes of silence. The first minute being for the soldiers who have died, and remember what they did. And the second minute is for those that they left behind. And I think one of the things that it gets touched on sometimes, but I think it's drowned out, is the sacrifice that the families make for their soldiers. So I went to Afghanistan. My children were very young. My oldest was 5 years old, I think, which maybe my son was 3, and my youngest daughter was a relative newborn. She was in their first year, and I was excited to go. I'd spent my entire adult life trained to go fight. Not that I think there's any glory in war, because my grandfather was captured at Dieppe, and I remember I told him when I was a teenager that I wanted to join the army. He's like, "You understand this ain't fun," and I was like, "Got it, yep." So I came in with my eyes open, but I wanted to fight because I wanted to make the world a better place. And that's when Jeff said, fundamentally about Canadian soldiers, our country was founded on people who wanted to make a better life for themselves, and they left the old world. Canadian soldiers, we go to our government sends us to play. Like every war we fight is to make a better peace. And I think Canadian soldiers fundamentally is, as cynical as some people can be, in you put on a hard shell. Fundamentally, in their hearts, they want to make the world a better place. So I was excited to go to Afghanistan and fight. And there's a personal thing for every soldier. You want to know if you've talked the talk for so long, can you actually walk the walk? There's something you need to know about yourself in that. So there was a lot of reasons, professionally and personally, that I was excited to go. And I had to say goodbye to my kids. It kind of hit home that I wasn't just going to war; they were too. And when I was over there were certain points that I realized if I get killed today, then I'm done. Like there's no more pain there. I'm off to wherever great beyond I'm going to go to, and suffering's over, and it's done for me. I don't even have to worry about paying taxes anymore. But for my kids, I will die for them over and over again for the rest of their lives. Like the day that my daughter graduates from high school, her dad won't be there. The day that my son, at the time, to this day, he still wants to be a soldier. But the day that he gets his commission, his dad won't be there to see it. When my youngest daughter gets married, I wouldn't be there to take her down the aisle. So the most seminal events in my children's lives, they're supposed to be the happiest times for them. For the rest of their lives, will always be darkened by the pain that their father died, when they were children. Right. So when we have Remembrance Day, it's remember the sacrifice of the soldiers you gave. There were some of the finest men and women that you'll ever meet. When you look at the families, the ones who really pay for this, and not just like me as a soldier, I made my kids pay, but what the country has asked of them to do, because it's a volunteer army, and most of us would not be in the army if our families didn't support us. That is something they pay for it for the rest of their lives. So like on Remembrance Day, it's not just like remember the guys and gals in uniform who aren't with us anymore. The fact that will haunt like whole families for the rest of their lives. And that is something
I should bring up that everybody has the same story. So I deployed, got warned off at September 11th. By Christmas that year, I was in Afghanistan. My kids were roughly the same age as his. My daughter had been born on the 28th of September. I deployed in December. So, the same nucleus. For me, the hardest point was we were about to launch on an air assault, and I had to write a letter to each of my kids and give to the Padre. And that's a real moment for a soldier when you realize you're fallible. Up to that point, you're invincible. But at that moment, this is what's really hard for soldiers, is that you're fallible at that point.
And part of our indoctrination to Army life and becoming soldiers is being taught like that sacrifice is worthwhile. Like valor is something that we treasure as members of the military community. And we sometimes forget there's a lot of valor that you have back at home. So it's like, oh, you could die, serve your country, and a lot of us it's been bred in your head. Okay, I'm good with that. I've come to terms with that. But coming to terms with what that means to your kids, like every time we turn on the news now, and like in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, the kids looked at me and they're like, "Are you going to have to go fight the Russians?" I was like, I don't know. Every time you hear saber rattling over North Korea, and they're like, "Are you going to have to fight the North Koreans?" I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Are you going to have to go fight ISIS? Like every time they see something on the news, like as children of a military parent, the first thing that crosses their mind is, does my dad or my mom have to go to war? And like that's
And we should talk about the Silver Cross Mother. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
'Cause so the Silver Cross Mother is an award at Remembrance Day. It's to a mother. It's now been expanded to a spouse or everything else. It's not just a mother, but someone who's lost them. They represent all of the families during the Remembrance Day ceremony. And they now when we fill out our forms, it used to be it was your mom. Okay, like if you got killed, it was your mom. Now it's my wife, my kids, my son. Like you can put everybody down there so that they can be awarded the Silver Cross. But it's a tradition that comes from recognizing the loss. So you'll see that in the ceremony, there's a ceremony remembering the soldiers and the veterans, and we changed it from Armistice Day to Remembrance Day because we had World War II, and then we had Korea, and then we had Afghanistan and everything else. So we didn't just call it Armistice Day. In other places, it's still called Armistice Day, but we call it Remembrance Day, so it's a bit more coverage. But you'll see when you watch the national ceremony at the Cenotaph, you will see that part where the Silver Cross Mother goes out, and previous to that, he or she is given an opportunity to go visit. There's presentations, there's other ceremonies that go on, and I think at that point you'll see that that part is a specific part of the overall ceremony.
When they talk about troops, the sacrifice and the strength of people in uniform, like I tell you, when you've got I told to explain to my son when I was going to Afghanistan and to my oldest daughter, like explaining the politics of the Taliban and everything else is a little bit hard. So I said, Dad, the Taliban's kind of like the Decepticons. Like that's what Dad's going to go fight bad guys. My son was like, "Does that make you Optimus Prime?" I'm like, "Well, no one is as cool as Optimus Prime, but kind of." Right. So that was that was how he understood.
I told my kids, Canadian soldiers protect the weak.
Yeah.
That was the mantra I gave my kids.
So you want to talk about like the strength and resilience of the human spirit isn't necessarily in a 41-year-old who spent his entire adult life preparing to go fight. It's an 11-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl and a 10-year-old girl. When they say, "Daddy, are you going to have to go fight?" and you say, "I might," like they give you a hug and go fight the bad guys and kill the Decepticons. Like you want to talk about the resilience and beauty of the human spirit. You see it in a kid who's that strong, not in an adult who has been trained for it for 20 years.
Well said.
So I'm going to close us off. So a couple of key messages. First of all, Jade and Jeff, thank you very much for the history lesson and more importantly, the personal stories. I was having a hard time kind of gathering myself up at the end. I would remind our listeners that November 11th is not only a day of rest from your work. It is a day of remembrance. We heard the personal stories of the soldiers. We also heard the families who are left behind and the tremendous sacrifice that our soldiers make for us to create a better country, who have, in tradition and history, really built our culture and our country. On November 11th, there are multiple celebrations, Remembrance Day celebrations, typically at the legislature, the Beverly Memorial Cenotaph, and the City of Edmonton does a service at the Butter Dome.
And my regiment fires the Royal Salute at the legislature. There'll also be a formal parade there this year marking the armistice. So if you look online, you'll find there's some really interesting Remembrance Day ceremonies going to be taking place this year.
That's great. And I would also remember now with 2 minutes of silence. We all know what that means. I am going to leave everyone with the very well-known poem by John McCrae in Flanders Fields. And I can tell you as a young person, and I encourage teachers, please keep giving the message, keep teaching our young people about Remembrance Day and in Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses row and row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
You've been listening to Leadership in Challenging Times with Dr. Jody Abbott and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson on the NorQuest College podcast. Any questions or suggestions on any episodes can be directed to us at podcast@norquest.ca. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please remember to subscribe using iTunes or Google Play and get updated when the new episodes become available. Thanks for listening.